The sterile hum of advanced machinery filled the air as Dr. Sarah Oyelaran stepped into the alien hospital ship's ward for the first time, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. The ward was vast and sprawling, walls sheathed in an iridescent silver material that seemed to shift with each passing second, reflecting eerie patterns of light from floating medical devices overhead. Sarah paused at the entrance, watching intently as Vex nurses moved swiftly between beds for armed beings whose blue-gray skin shimmered softly under fluorescent lights. Each nurse was a stark silhouette against the radiant ceiling panels, their movements precise yet filled with an unmistakable sense of urgency and despair. They were attending to patients who cried out in pain without ceasing, voices echoing across the ward as if each plea for relief had been swallowed by countless others before them. A sudden scream pierced through the ambient noise, a child's voice, shrill with agony. Sarah's eyes snapped towards one end of the ward, where an older Vex nurse was setting what appeared to be multiple fractures in the limb of a young patient, without any sign of pain management or anesthesia. The cries were raw and gut-wrenching, pulling at her heartstrings like taut wires. "Dr. Oyelaran," a familiar voice called from behind. Sarah turned to see High Nurse Vexa approaching with hurried steps across the polished metal floors. "Welcome. We are glad to have you here." Sarah nodded stiffly, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene of agony unfolding before them. The air was thick and heavy. It smelled faintly metallic, a mixture of disinfectant chemicals and the pervasive scent of unwashed suffering. "I need to see your emergency supplies," Sarah said abruptly, already moving towards one of the walls lined with rows upon rows of storage units. High Nurse Vexa hesitated before speaking again. "Our protocols do not align exactly with human medical practices, Dr. Oyelaran." Sarah stopped and turned sharply back toward her. "Then maybe it's time they did," she said firmly. Vexa's eyes met hers briefly, but flickered away, as if looking at something deep within herself. "You misunderstand our methods," Vexa replied softly yet resolutely, though there was a hint of exhaustion in the alien nurse's voice that betrayed her inner conflict. "Not all suffering is meant to be endured," Sarah countered heatedly, stepping closer towards the storage units and beginning to open them systematically despite High Nurse Vexa's lingering hesitation. "And I won't allow this pain to continue any longer than necessary." Vexa watched silently for a moment before she sighed deeply. "I wish there was another way." Sarah's hands paused on one of the storage doors, her eyes narrowing as she met Vexa's gaze once more. She could see the weariness etched into every line and curve of the Vex nurse's forearms. "What exactly is stopping you from using painkillers?" Sarah demanded fiercely. Vexa swallowed hard, looking away again before speaking softly but clearly. "Our religious texts dictate that suffering purifies us." Sarah blinked slowly. "You mean there are no medicines to dull their agony?" "None allowed," Vexa confirmed quietly yet firmly. She added after a moment's hesitation, "We have medications, but they are forbidden by law and tradition." "Then why am I here, if not to help them?" Sarah questioned with a mix of bewilderment and incredulity. High Nurse Vexa sighed deeply once more before explaining in gentle tones, "Your presence provides hope, proof that there are those who believe differently." "Hope isn't enough," muttered Sarah under her breath as she resumed rifling through the medical supplies. Her eyes caught sight of something familiar, but labeled with alien symbols and terminology. Vexa's voice was softer now when she spoke again. "Please end our suffering, Dr. Oyelaran." The nurse's expression seemed to soften momentarily at Sarah's determined face, before adding in almost a whisper, "You're human. You have medicines we're forbidden from using." Sarah felt her chest tighten as Vexa turned away quickly and returned back down the aisle of patient beds toward yet another agonized cry for help. Staring after her, Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could see that this was not just a disagreement over medical practices, but a clash between deeply held beliefs and the undeniable reality of human compassion. The hospital ward seemed to pulse with tension as each painful scream filled the air, a stark reminder of both suffering and potential. With a deep breath, Sarah made up her mind. Feeling a storm brewing within her resolve, she would not leave this place without making an impact, whatever that might entail. But first things first, she needed access to those restricted supplies, if only to prove what could be done here in the face of outdated traditions and rigid laws. As night fell outside beyond the ship's windows, though it was impossible for Sarah to tell given how they never seemed to change, she found herself alone once more in one of the hospital's quieter corridors. Behind her, through a partially open door at the end of an adjacent corridor, faint echoes of suffering and distress could still be heard from the ward. She had managed to locate some kind of keycard access device near what appeared to be restricted storage units, likely containing those forbidden medicines she believed might provide relief for these patients. But every action would have repercussions. Breaking HFY laws meant facing severe consequences, perhaps even expulsion or worse within their society. Sarah's fingers hovered over the card reader as her mind wrestled with an impossible choice: adhere to alien protocols and remain a passive observer, or take decisive steps that could change everything but also risk everything she held dear. The path ahead was fraught with moral dilemmas and legal barriers, yet every fiber of her being yearned for action rather than inaction. It's clear what needs doing, Sarah thought fiercely, yet hesitation gnawed at the edges of her resolve. If these measures backfired, what would Vexa think once she realized I'm crossing this line? But there was no time to ponder further. Another scream pierced through from the ward, unmistakable sound of bone breaking without proper anesthesia. Sarah's heart skipped a beat and then clenched tightly. She had seen enough suffering today that could have been alleviated with proper care. With one final breath for courage, she slid her own ID card into the reader and entered the code sequence necessary to unlock these restricted units containing medicines forbidden by HFY law, but so desperately needed now amidst all this anguish. The door hissed open slowly, revealing rows upon rows of vials filled with syringes labeled in alien script yet unmistakably medical. A small part of her trembled at what she was about to do, knowing it defied everything that HFY stood for and risked everything here on their ship. But another, larger part of Sarah felt a growing sense of purpose. This could be the start, a way forward from pain into relief, if only by breaking rules that seemed designed solely to prolong agony. She reached out slowly toward one of the vials, ready now not just to offer aid, but also challenge these traditions in the name of compassion and humanity's unwavering belief against needless suffering. And Sarah faces an impossible choice. Dr. Sarah Oyelaran sprinted down the dimly lit corridor of the alien hospital ship, her footsteps echoing off metallic walls as she darted towards a distant ward filled with cries and moans. The air was thick with acrid scent, sterilizers, antiseptics, and an undercurrent of fear mixed in with desperation. Reaching the emergency surgery room, Sarah skidded to a halt beside High Nurse Vexa, who stood rigidly by the patient's side, a young HFY male lying pale and bloodied on the operating table. His body was racked with spasms, his face contorted into agonized screams even before he had been properly anesthetized. Sarah, Vexa whispered urgently through chattering teeth, her eyes wide with fear, but also determination shining brightly despite visible exhaustion. "We need to act quickly. He's losing too much blood." "I know," Sarah replied firmly, already reaching for the sterile gauzes and instruments laid out beside them. The overhead lights flickered intermittently. Above their heads, shadows danced across the room as each one came on or went off. "We can't proceed without pain management," Vexa insisted, her voice barely audible over the young patient's agonized screams. "According to our laws, I understand your religion forbids it," Sarah cut in tersely, glancing up at the ceiling where a small icon of some celestial deity was mounted inside an intricate circlia, symbol for their sacred beliefs against pain relief during surgery. She could feel her hands trembling slightly as she prepared herself emotionally and physically for what had to be done. "But there's no time," Sarah continued in a low, steady voice meant only for Vex's ears. "The boy will die from shock if we don't sedate him." Vexa stared back at her with conflicted pain etched into every line of her face and body posture, a silent plea mixed in with fierce resolve. "Please," she whispered finally, after several heavy moments passed between them, eyes filled to brim. "I know what you're thinking. I've seen enough today that needed intervention." Sarah reached for the syringe containing a dose of human analgesics and injected it swiftly into the patient's Roman IV line while murmuring comforting words under her breath, aimed more at calming him rather than his pain. "High Priest Vexa," she said aloud, catching sight of one of the nurse aides rushing over with another set of supplies. "You just made a decision that will change everything here." Vexa blinked hard, as if waking from deep sleep or perhaps disbelief, her blue-gray skin turning slightly gray around the edges. "And what do you intend to do?" she asked hoarsely, voice barely more than breath, but unmistakably urgent in its tone, now directed towards Sarah instead of their patient's condition. Sarah met Vex's gaze head on with clear determination burning brightly within hers. "I'm going to save this boy," she declared firmly, without backing down even a millimeter under the weight of such heavy scrutiny from those piercing empathic eyes staring straight through her soul for answers. She began operating quickly and efficiently, feeling each cut into flesh, suturing wounds expertly despite knowing full well these actions might be seen as sacrilegious here on this Vex ship. Around them, emergency lights flickered more frequently, shadows crept across sterile sheets draped over the patient's body while alarms blared in warning tones about vitals dropping dangerously low. Vexa watched silently from her place beside Sarah throughout the procedure, eyes never leaving Dr. Oyelaran, even as they worked meticulously together under these trying circumstances, where every move could mean life or death, literally speaking, here inside this alien hospital ship. But when it was finally over, and all thanks to that single dose of human medicine administered without permission but deemed necessary, they both shared a breathless moment of silence filled with palpable tension and relief, mingled equally powerful sensations throughout their bodies. The young Vex male lay still on the table, his breathing even now though visibly weakened. Sarah wiped sweat off her forehead, using the back of her hand, before turning fully towards Vexa, who remained frozen beside them both, still silent, but watching carefully every small detail about how things transpired once that line had been crossed. "You just committed heresy," came Vex's voice barely above whisper level again, now as if those words alone were too heavy to be spoken out loud without fear of repercussions or divine wrath raining down upon all who dared challenge such stringent rules against pain management during surgical procedures by Vex religious doctrines written firmly into stone tablets long ago. "I did," Sarah acknowledged calmly, with no room left for denial in her tone now either. But I couldn't let him suffer any longer like this. Vexa nodded slowly, a mixture of emotions flashing rapidly across her face: shock, respect, concern, all intertwined beautifully yet messily into complex tapestry only she seemed capable of deciphering completely. "Word will spread," Vexa added solemnly, after several long seconds passed without further conversation between them. "The High Priest himself is coming." Sarah looked up sharply from where she'd been packing away surgical tools left behind now the procedure was complete, her expression turning grim as reality set in fully about potential consequences awaiting ahead. "That's okay," she replied just as quietly yet firmly, back towards Vexa, once more meeting eyes again for a brief moment before turning to start cleaning herself off and preparing both mentally and physically for whatever lay down this new path they'd collectively chosen together now, despite everything else standing against them otherwise. Dr. Sarah Oyelaran's quarters were stark and unforgiving, a room barely larger than her operating table aboard the T-Rex hospital ship. The walls glowed softly under an eerie blue light that cast long shadows across the metal floor plates. Faint whirs and hums of the ship's systems filtered through from outside, punctuated by distant alarms still echoing from earlier in the day. Sarah stood at a small rectangular window set into one wall, only natural-looking feature among the clinical surroundings, gazing out over a vast expanse of starlit blackness. Her reflection stared back at her grimly dark circles underlined tired eyes that betrayed days and nights without sleep, worry etched permanently onto forehead creases. The door slid open quietly behind her. She turned to see High Nurse Vexa standing there, forearms crossed defensively, a cross-chest plate armor-like garment over body suit beneath, which faint blue veins pulsed subtly but distinctly visible through translucent skin. "Sarah," said Vexa softly, as she stepped inside the room, closing it gently with a low hiss of machinery. "They've heard." "I know." Sarah's voice was even, calm despite underlying tension that coiled tight within her chest like barbed wire waiting to snap at any moment now, if given half chance. "High Priest is coming for you," Vexa continued gravely. Her empathic abilities made every word carry weight far heavier than air itself could ever bear. Pain and suffering seemed to hang visibly around them both here in confined space of Sarah's quarters now. "I won't deny what I did." Sarah turned fully toward her visitor, eyes steady on face visible under nurse's robes that pooled softly at feet as Vexa moved closer into room. "And I won't apologize either." Understanding flickered across V's features, a complex mix of emotions played out briefly before settling once more beneath calm exterior. "You shouldn't," she murmured, lifting one pair of arms to gesture slightly toward Sarah, in silent support or perhaps reassurance instead. "But you should know many here disagree with religious doctrine too." Sarah nodded slowly, this time accepting not just the information, but also implicit trust offered by Vexa's words and presence alone within her restricted space now. "It's a hard truth for anyone to face," she admitted after brief silence fell between them once more. "But suffering isn't something that brings enlightenment or understanding, it only teaches us fear." Vexa sighed deeply through slender nostrils, exhaling slowly, as if pushing thoughts away from forefront consciousness before answering back in quiet voice laden with sorrow and yet still holding on to hope somehow. "You have no idea how many of my colleagues secretly agree," she confessed instead. "But pain is considered holy here among T-Rex people. Suffering purifies souls, it says. Then perhaps our souls need to be purified differently." Sarah's tone was resolute now, as she faced Vexa directly without backing down from gaze that held all manner of judgment and potential punishment awaiting outside those closed doors. A long silence fell between them, then pregnant with unspoken agreements or disagreements hanging heavily in air. Finally, Vexa spoke up again, breaking through tension first, though voice still remained soft, cautious against walls around room, echoing her words loudly, instead making each syllable carry more weight than ever before now. High Priest will arrive soon, she warned, glancing toward entrance briefly, where faint alarms still hummed distantly from elsewhere on ship. You should prepare. He'll do what needs doing. Sarah nodded in agreement, despite knowing full well consequences could be severe if High Priest deemed her actions irredeemable enough to warrant punishment beyond confinement already imposed. High Nurse, Vexa began hesitantly, after another short pause-filled silence, gaze shifting uncertainly between face reflected back from window and person standing before them here now inside Sarah's quarters. Why did you choose this path? Sarah met her eyes squarely, returning question with honest answer, though knowing full well it might mean more than just personal conviction at stake if revealed fully, out loud, in such tense environment. Because compassion isn't optional, she said firmly, stepping closer toward Vexa, now almost sharing breath space between them. When someone's hurting, ignoring that pain is a lie we tell ourselves to feel better about not helping. Vexa blinked rapidly twice, then 3 times before finally nodding slowly in apparent agreement, though still wearing mask of reserved professionalism around face. Perhaps, she began hesitantly, again, voice barely above whisper level now, as if testing waters for possibility beyond strict religious doctrines upheld here among Vex people. This meeting will change everything. Sarah took a deep breath, exhaling sharply through nose with effort visible and slight tightening of jaw muscles, preparing herself mentally against whatever lay ahead. I'm ready, she said finally, after brief silence filled room once more now that both women faced reality clearly laid out before them unflinchingly. Let's see what they want. The door to Sarah's quarters hissed open again shortly thereafter, this time accompanied by louder, sharper alarms signaling high importance of visitor entering now. High Priest Var entered the small space with deliberate strides, despite obvious discomfort evident in posture of her arms crossed defensively over chest plate armor like garment, as if trying desperately maintain control even within confined area here among ship's quarters. Dr. Oyelaran, he greeted stiffly upon reaching Sarah, still standing near window now, eyes meeting stern gaze of High Priest unflinchingly, despite gravity of moment clearly weighing heavily on all involved parties present today inside this tiny room, surrounded by clinical sterility and blue artificial light glowing softly beneath them both. I've come to address your transgressions, Var continued without further preamble, immediately getting down business matter at hand. Now, your actions go against holy teachings. Sarah nodded once, accepting gravity of situation before replying directly back towards High Priest standing opposite her here inside these small quarters on ship, though knowing full well everything about this conversation would likely be relayed far and wide across Vex society soon enough, making any word spoken carry monumental significance now. Your religious doctrine forbids pain management, she began calmly, eyes steady upon face of man before them still, despite obvious tension rising visibly between them both under weight of impending confrontation here today. Yet I believe everyone deserves relief from suffering, not just as divine purification, but because it's a basic human right. Var's expression tightened further, stern gaze sharpening into something sharper now, that held thinly veiled accusation within depths visible beneath surface professionalism displayed so carefully by all to vex leaders. "You're challenging Holy Writ," he accused flatly instead of directly, addressing points Sarah had just made about pain management and basic human rights. "Your methods are ungodly." "I'm showing mercy." Sarah's tone remained level yet firm under gravity of accusation leveled at her here, now among ships quarters, eyes still steady upon face opposite, reflecting back similar mixed emotions visible there as well through carefully controlled exterior, or presented publicly by T-Vex leadership. "Pain teaches," T-Far countered almost immediately in rebuttal, voice taking on slightly more heated edge despite outwardly maintaining composed stance, even amid rising tension between them both here, now inside ship's quarters. "Suffering is purification." Sarah shook her head slowly, denying validity of point made, outright refusing to back down under pressure or accusation levied against actions already taken earlier today. "Pain teaches nothing except how to fear," she argued firmly instead, voice unwavering beneath weighty scrutiny directed toward them both now from High Priest, standing opposite, within confined space here aboard ship. "Compassion teaches us empathy. Love shows connection between all beings regardless of species or belief system. Pain only hurts, nothing more." Far's eyes narrowed sharply under challenge, presented directly back towards him now by human doctor despite clear violation religious doctrine already committed earlier today. "This defiance will not be tolerated," he warned sternly, instead lowering gaze briefly downward from meeting point where Sarah stood facing him here within confined quarters of ship, though knowing full well every word would likely echo far and wide across T-Vex society soon enough, carry a monumental weight in consequence now as much potential for change too under gravity of moment clearly unfolding before them both. "I cannot go against patient's needs," Sarah countered, just as firmly however, gaze still steady upon face opposite, meeting eyes unwaveringly despite clear warning issued by High Priest standing there within confined space here aboard ship's quarters. "Even if it means facing punishment." Far seemed taken aback briefly at Sarah's unflinching resolve, though maintained composed exterior, nonetheless, even amid rising tension between them both now under gravity of moment clearly unfolding among ship's quarters. "Your actions are heretical," he declared finally, after brief silence filled small room once more before continuing on in similar vein toward final decision about what course would be taken next despite obvious disagreement already established here within confined space aboard T-Vex hospital ship. "And must stop. I understand the consequences," Sarah acknowledged calmly yet firmly, instead accepting gravity of situation fully now, as much unflinching resolve shown during earlier confrontation with High Priest standing opposite, though knowing full well every word spoken carried monumental weight in consequence too despite potential for change also lying ahead under gravity of moment clearly unfolding here among ship's quarters. But T-Far's eyes flickered ever so slightly, uncertainty briefly clouded stern gaze visible there now amid rising tension between them both within confined space aboard hospital ship, as if perhaps some small part inside him began questioning validity of religious doctrine enforced despite obvious suffering endured by patients already committed earlier today under Sarah's care, though quickly masked beneath outward professionalism still maintained publicly among T-Vex leadership. "Punishment will be decided," he said finally, instead deflecting away from open confrontation back toward procedural matters now despite clear disagreement established between them both here, within confined quarters of ship. Until then you remain in confinement. Sarah nodded once more, accepting gravity of situation fully as well, though eyes still steady upon face opposite, meeting gaze unwaveringly under weighty scrutiny directed thereto, even amid rising tension clearly unfolding before them both under gravity of moment now. "I understand," she said calmly yet firmly, instead finally ending confrontation here among ship's quarters despite obvious disagreement established between High Priest standing opposite and herself earlier today, despite knowing full well every word spoken would likely echo far and wide across HFY society, soon enough carry a monumental weight in consequence too, even amid potential for change also lying ahead under gravity of moment clearly unfolding now. The door hissed closed behind the retreating figure of High Priest Far, leaving Sarah alone once more within her small quarters. The alarms outside had quieted to a low murmur, as if sensing the confrontation was over and awaiting whatever verdict would be handed down next. She turned back towards Vexa, who stood silently near entrance, supportive but reserved in equal measure. "We'll see what tomorrow brings," Sarah said quietly, meeting Vexa's eyes again after brief moment of silence hung heavily between them now under gravity of recent confrontation still lingering visibly despite formal conclusion reached just moments earlier among ship's quarters here aboard Vex hospital vessel. "For better or worse." Vexa nodded slowly in understanding, though mask remained carefully controlled beneath surface, a mix of emotions visible through faint blue veins pulsing subtly beneath translucent skin, as if perhaps sensing weighty significance now lying ahead under gravity of moment clearly unfolding despite uncertainty still hanging heavily over all involved parties present today aboard ship. "Until then," she murmured softly, instead finally offering small gesture toward Sarah with one pair of arms, almost hesitantly yet reassuringly supportive even amid rising tension lingering visibly between them both here within confined quarters of vessel now, as if perhaps sensing potential for change also lying ahead despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among Vex society. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement, stepping closer towards Vexa briefly, almost sharing breath space again under gravity of moment clearly unfolding even amid rising tension still lingering visibly here within confined quarters aboard ship's vessel now, as if perhaps sensing potential for change also lying ahead despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among Vex society. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, instead offering small gesture back towards Vexa with eyes meeting face opposite unwaveringly under gravity of moment clearly unfolding here within confined quarters aboard ship's vessel now, as if perhaps sensing potential for change also lying ahead despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among Vex society. Vexa nodded once more in response, lifting one pair of arms to gesture slightly towards Sarah, again almost hesitantly yet reassuringly supportive even amid rising tension still lingering visibly here within confined quarters aboard ship's vessel now, as if perhaps sensing potential for change also lying ahead despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among Vex society. "Until tomorrow," she murmured softly, instead finally turning to leave confines of Sarah's quarters with a low hiss for machinery signaling closing doors once more back towards hallway beyond now under gravity of moment clearly unfolding even amid rising tension still lingering visibly here aboard ship's vessel despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among HFY society. Sarah watched her go, the door sliding shut behind Vexa and leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. The room felt colder now without the warmth of another presence, the soft blue glow casting eerie shadows across walls, as if mocking any hope for change lingering under gravity, of moment clearly unfolding here aboard ship's vessel despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation against religious doctrine enforced among HFY society. But Sarah knew better than to give in just yet, not when there was still a chance, however slim it might be now, to bring about real healing not only for patients, but also for the very heart of this alien society itself that had long been bound by rigid adherence to suffering as holy purification against basic human needs and rights instead. She turned back towards window set into one wall, gazing out once more at starlit blackness beyond vessel's hull, a reminder perhaps of vast universe waiting outside with endless possibilities for change despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation aboard HFY's hospital ship under gravity, of moment clearly unfolding now, as much potential also lying ahead despite weighty scrutiny directed thereto even amid rising tension still lingering visibly here among confined quarters. And in that silence she steeled herself against whatever lay ahead, determined to see this through no matter the cost or consequences awaiting beyond confines of small room where confrontation had just taken place aboard HFY's hospital vessel under gravity, of moment clearly unfolding now, as much potential also lying ahead despite obvious disagreement already established earlier during recent confrontation among ship's quarters here. IND Chapter 4 Quarantine Room. High Nurse Vexa stood outside Sarah's quarters, her forearms trembling slightly as she prepared herself to enter once more. The air was heavy with anticipation and the faint scent of sanitizer that clung to everything aboard the HFY ship. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool metal walls against her blue-gray skin, before sliding open the door. "Dr. Oyelaran," Vexa called softly as she stepped inside. Sarah turned from where she stood by the window, her eyes meeting Vexa's exhausted gaze through the soft glow of the room's lights. "Ready?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding towards the hallway beyond their quarters. They had discussed this moment in hushed tones earlier that night. Vexa would guide Sarah to one of the quarantine wards where patients suffered without hope, and no medical intervention could save them. "Yes," Vexa replied, her voice a low murmur. "Follow me." She began walking down the sterile hallway with its metallic flooring and flickering blue lights, the sound of their footsteps echoing slightly as they moved towards a door marked Quarantine Ward 5. Sarah followed closely behind, trying to process what she was about to witness. As Vexa opened the quarantine room's thick door, a wave of despair washed over her. The sterile environment inside clashed with cries and groans coming from within. 4 alien patients laid on identical cots around the edges of the room. Each one looked like they were being torn apart by their own bodies, struggling against invisible bonds that only pain could see. Vexa paused for a moment, looking back at Sarah with sorrow-filled eyes before stepping forward into the room. "Dr. Oyelaran," she said firmly but gently, turning towards her fellow HFY patients, "this is what we need to end." Sarah nodded solemnly and walked beside Vexa as they approached one of the beds where a patient named Toru writhed in agony, his face contorted with pain despite his attempts at holding still. "Toru," Sarah said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I'm here to help you." Vexa stepped closer, positioning herself behind Sarah, watching as she reached into the medical bag brought from their quarters and pulled out a small syringe filled with palliative medication specially formulated for non-human anatomy, but designed to ease suffering without curing. She then injected it carefully into Toru's neck. Toru's breathing slowed almost immediately. His body began to relax beneath Sarah's touch as she held him gently, speaking softly into Vex language she had learned during her stay aboard the ship. "It will be okay," Sarah said soothingly. "You're going home now." As Vexa watched with tears streaming down her blue-gray face from all four eyes, each arm curling protectively around herself, a soft whisper escaped Taurus' lips. "Thank you." Vexa moved to the next patient, a young Vex female named Zara, who was gasping for breath between convulsions. Vexa stepped forward again, but paused as she saw Sarah, already leaning over her with another syringe. "Zara," Sarah said gently, placing her hand on the girl's forehead and speaking in soft tones designed to calm rather than scare. Vexa couldn't watch anymore, turning away slightly while still close enough that she felt every shudder of Zara's body as she succumbed peacefully under Sarah's care. This has gone on far too long," Vexa whispered, her voice barely audible even within the small space confined by metal walls and medical equipment. Sarah nodded, moving on to another patient, a male named Kale, who was sweating profusely from feverish delirium mixed with unbearable pain. "Kale, listen to me," Sarah spoke softly, placing a cool cloth against his burning forehead while she worked carefully around the Roman foreport. "We can ease your suffering." Vexa stepped closer again and looked at Kale's face as he began breathing steadily after receiving his injection. His eyes fluttered open briefly, then closed permanently. "In peace." "Thank you," were his final words before falling silent forever. Vexa let out a sob, tears mixing with the sweat on her skin under quarantine room lights that made everything seem colder than it truly was. Sarah moved to each patient one by one, injecting them, speaking softly, watching their suffering ease, and knowing she'd given them peace in their final hours despite everything this ship's strict religious doctrine forbade. The room filled with a new silence as bodies lay still, without fear or torment, only peaceful acceptance of what was coming. Doctor Oyelaran," Vexa finally said, stepping closer to her colleague amidst the eerie quiet now pervasive throughout quarantine ward's confines. "I've watched thousands die screaming." She wiped tears from two sets of eyes with trembling fingers. "You gave them this peace in hours." Sarah sighed deeply and looked around at each peaceful face, no more agony etched across their features. "This is what medicine should be," she whispered back, her voice thick but determined. Her gaze held Vex's firmly, as they both understood the profound weight of that moment, what they had done to her to bring healing not only physically, but also emotionally and spiritually within this rigid society bound by pain's sanctity alone. But their silence was short-lived. Alarms suddenly blared through the ship, followed quickly by heavy boots pounding down hallway towards quarantine room, where Sarah stood beside Vexa, surrounded now amidst bodies at rest under palliative care. Security guards burst in almost immediately after that alarm sounded, flashing lights from helmets illuminating every corner of confined space sharply as they aimed weapons cautiously around each patient's resting form. "Dr. Oyelaran, High Nurse Vexa," one guard shouted sternly while others secured the room with cautionary measures now clearly enforced against both medical personnel present here inside quarantine ward boundaries and patients laid out peacefully under their care. "You are under arrest." Vex's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Sarah, then back towards guards standing ready to take them away from this place of suffering. Finally, eased yet now condemned by Tita. Vex religious laws still holding sway, despite change brought about momentarily through compassion instead. Sarah nodded sharply, accepting the inevitable, but also knowing they had done what was right even if consequences would follow. She took Vex's hand for a moment before letting it go to face security's demands with unwavering resolve, both women understanding that while today ended differently than hoped, their actions spoke louder and deeper within hearts now touched by mercy beyond pain's grasp. And Chapter 5 Public Trial. The sterile white walls of the quarantine room faded into darkness as alarms blared throughout Vex space station, piercing through the peaceful silence that had settled over Sarah and Vex's recent act of mercy. Security guards burst in, their heavy boots thudding against the floor with a sense of urgency. Flashlights from helmets illuminated every corner sharply, casting long shadows across the solemn faces of those who had just been laid to rest in peace. "Dr. Oyelaran," one guard called out sternly over his shoulder while others secured the room around them. "Hi, Nurse Vexa. You are under arrest." Vex's breath caught in her throat as she glanced from Sarah to the guards and back again. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and determination, fear for what was coming, but resolution that their actions had been justified. "Understood," Sarah said quietly without hesitation, releasing Vex's hand, but not looking away. She met Vex's gaze steadily before addressing the guard directly. "May we speak to the High Council first? I believe this needs to be addressed publicly." The lead guard hesitated, his expression tense as he considered her request. The sound of murmurs began echoing from outside the room. Other Vex and humans alike were gathering around, drawn by the commotion. "We will allow you a trial," another voice spoke up, sharper than before this time, "but under strict conditions." "Understood." Sarah nodded firmly again as guards ushered them through corridors lined with flickering emergency lights towards an assembly hall where crowds had already gathered. The hall was vast, its walls adorned with intricate carvings depicting Vex mythology and religious doctrines, each stone etching a silent testament to their faith. The air buzzed with tension, whispers turned into murmurs, until they formed a roar that filled the chamber. Sarah felt eyes upon her from all sides as she entered alongside Vexa, flanked by armed guards who kept them at bay. At the front of the hall stood a high dais raised several steps above ground level, where the council's ancient figures draped in ceremonial robes that shone with opalescent hues. The air was thick and heavy, an unspoken weight hung over everyone present, palpable as Vex's own grief had been under quarantine. Vex officials stepped forward to address them formally. "Dr. Oyelaran," he began loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear clearly through amplification devices overhead, "you are accused of heresy by administering pain relief medication without permission from religious authorities, medication which is forbidden by our laws and beliefs." Sarah took a deep breath before speaking directly into the microphone provided. "I understand your concerns," she replied calmly but firmly. "I do not stand here to defend my actions. Rather, I want you all to see what we witnessed today." Without further ado, Sarah began projecting images onto screens lining both sides of the chamber wall, horrifying visuals that brought gasps from onlookers, patients screaming in agony, nurses breaking down as they held their loved ones during final moments, filled with unbearable torment. Children crying out for relief that never came because religion dictated otherwise. "These are your patients," Sarah continued somberly, amidst shocked silence. "These recordings show what happens when we ignore suffering, when pain is seen not just as a physical manifestation of illness, but used to enforce religious doctrine." Sarah paused, allowing those words to sink in while Vexa stood quietly beside her, hands trembling slightly despite herself. "This," Sarah continued softly yet clearly, into the microphone again, "is the reality your faith creates, a world where mercy itself becomes forbidden because it's seen as weakening divine will rather than recognizing human frailty." The room fell silent once more. Even breathing seemed hushed now, under weight of emotions rising within everyone present after seeing such explicit evidence before them. Then, stepping forward beside Sarah, Vexa spoke up for the first time since being arrested. "I am Vex," she declared firmly, but with unmistakable weariness echoing through her voice. "But I also feel every patient's pain, every agonizing moment endured by those who can't speak for themselves within these walls anymore." Her eyes scanned crowds, searching for understanding among faces that reflected back confusion and disbelief at times. "I believe," Vexa continued forcefully, pushing past any lingering doubts or fears still gnawing inside, "but I also know suffering isn't sacred. It needs to end so patients may live more fully until their time comes naturally." Silence lingered again as impact of what they'd witnessed hit harder, deeper than before. "Sarah gave them peace," Vexa clarified, finally turning back towards her colleague, now side by side once more on trial dais where guards stood vigilant. "If that makes us both guilty, then damn me too for daring to bring mercy into this place." A murmur spread quickly throughout chamber as Vex began discussing amongst themselves, some nodding silently while others looked conflicted, unsure how much change they could embrace without shattering foundation their society rested upon. As if sensing growing sentiment rippling through crowd around them and among council members above stage, where High Priestess Irina sat flanked by lesser officials studying each face carefully before making any decision regarding fate of two women who stood out as singular voices amidst sea of conformity. Others, Sarah called out softly yet clearly, addressing nurses who'd worked alongside Vexa throughout years, under same harsh conditions described in footage shown earlier. One nurse stepped forward hesitantly, but then another followed closely. After seeing others do so too soon, whole lines began forming along back rows stretching towards entrance, as if moving inexorably closer to center stage, where Sarah and Vexa waited resolutely alongside each other, awaiting outcome of proceedings now unfolding much faster than either had anticipated. Doctors joined nurses next. Families of the dead whose loved ones found peace during last hours before passing also came forward quietly, adding their voices, until entire assembly hall buzzed with collective support behind these two women accused, but who'd brought compassion where only agony seemed acceptable earlier today, when they began giving injections under cover of darkness within quarantine room. Sarah's eyes scanned crowd now filled almost entirely by those standing up for change, felt surge of hope mixed deeply within fear still lurking close at hand over possible consequences awaiting them if High Council ruled against mercy after all. "This is what true medicine should be," Sarah spoke clearly once more into microphone hovering above trial dais, where guards remained ever vigilant despite changing dynamics now shifting towards support rather than condemnation among onlookers. "Easing suffering so patients may live free from torment until their final moments come." As she finished speaking, Another surge of murmurs swept through crowd, this time filled not with shock or disbelief, but growing sense that perhaps times were indeed ripe for change within Vex society. High Priestess Irina finally stood up, straightening robe around her before addressing assembly formally. "Let there be silence," she commanded softly yet clearly. Carrying weight due to position held above all others present here today during historic trial brought forth by one human doctor and alien nurse, working together amidst rigid traditions bound tightly by pain's sanctity alone. When room fell quiet once more, High Priestess turned towards Sarah and Vexa directly. "Do you admit guilt for actions taken under quarantine ward?" she asked pointedly yet without malice evident in words spoken clearly into amplification device above dais, where they stood together resolutely facing council, now faced with decision whether to uphold rigid laws or embrace mercy brought through compassionate acts despite risks involved. "Yes," Sarah replied simply, after brief pause, allowing Vex's hand slip back into hers amidst growing murmurs among crowd behind them. "But I stand here not out of shame, but conviction that suffering must end for true healing to begin." Priestess Irina nodded slowly, then looked around chamber before turning eyes back towards both women, still resolutely facing her directly, without flinching away from judgment hanging heavy over proceedings now. "Very well," she said finally, voice carrying clearly across assembled masses. "You will not be punished further for what was done under quarantine room earlier. Tade actions taken were justified in light of evidence presented here and support shown by many others present." A wave of relief washed through Sarah as guards began lowering their weapons slightly, while crowd erupted into quiet applause mixed with sighs of deep collective exhale, marking significant turning point within Vex society, moving forward beyond rigid traditions now shattered under weight of compassion. Finally allowed entry despite risks involved. Sarah turned towards Vexa, squeezing her hand tightly amidst growing murmurs around them. "We did what was right," she whispered softly yet clearly enough for only High Nurse to hear, in mid-celebration breaking out among crowd behind dais, where they stood resolutely facing uncertain future now unfolding before their eyes after historic trial that changed everything overnight. And as High Priestess Irina turned towards masses gathered below stage once more, addressing them directly this time, rather than council above who had just shifted paradigm within society, moving forward with new understanding born from mercy shown amidst rigid traditions upheld until today from henceforth, she declared solemnly yet clearly, carrying weight due to position held. Pain relief will be allowed under strict medical guidelines, compassion recognized as sacred alongside divine will rather than opposed by it. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause and cheers, breaking the silence that had hung heavy in the air moments before. Sarah's heart swelled with relief and hope for what lay ahead, while Vexa felt tears brimming at corners of her eyes, not just out of joy, but also recognition that their actions today would ripple far beyond this moment, changing lives immeasurably within Vex society, moving forward now towards more compassionate understanding despite long-held traditions enforced until recently under strictest interpretations possible. High Priestess Irina turned one final time towards Sarah and Vexa, still standing resolutely side by side amidst growing support around them. "Thank you," she said simply, nodding respectfully before turning back to address assembly formally. "Once again, let this moment serve as reminder that compassion is power equal to any divine force. You must recognize it within ourselves if we wish true healing for all beings moving forward." And with those final words spoken clearly, amidst cheers echoing across vast hall where Sarah and Vexa stood together, symbolically marking turning point towards more compassionate future despite rigid traditions upheld until today. And Chapter 6 in W. Ward. The day had arrived. A new chapter was unfolding amidst whispers and palpable anticipation. Aboard the sprawling alien hospital ship, the corridors hummed with activity as nurses scurried from room to room, their four-armed movements swift yet graceful despite the tension that lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. Dr. Sarah Oyelaran stood at the entrance of Ward 13, her heart racing alongside the beeping monitors inside. She had not slept since returning from the trial, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and possibilities swirling together into one cohesive vision. Relief would soon replace suffering here. To her right, High Nurse Vexa waited anxiously near the double doors leading to the ward's interior. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked softly without turning towards Vexa. Vexa nodded silently, but then looked away toward Ward 13, where a steady stream of medical equipment had been brought in overnight. Human inventions such as painkillers, anesthetic machines, and even surgical lighting. The contrast between this modern setup with its effects furnishings was stark yet somehow fitting for the groundbreaking shift happening here. "Let's do it," Vexa whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs outside where curious onlookers gathered to witness the first step towards a transformed approach in caring for their sick and injured. They stepped inside together, as if walking into history itself. The ward was dimly lit by two Vex lamps, whose soft blue light flickered gently against walls adorned with intricate patterns symbolizing healing prayers. A mixture of scents permeated the air: sterility from antiseptic wipes, comfort from herbal teas brewing nearby, and an underlying anxiety that lingered despite recent events. Sarah's eyes scanned each bed carefully. Patients had been prepped and settled quietly by Vex's team. "First case?" Sarah prompted gently. "Yes," came a soft reply from across the ward, where another nurse stood beside a young child with bandages wrapped around their arm, in place of splints, evidence that traditional methods were still being used while new systems took hold. But his was changing today. Modern medicine would soon eclipse old beliefs here within these walls. "Bring them over," Sarah instructed, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she faced next. First human intervention for Vex patients, after decades bound by strict religious practices forbidding pain relief under any circumstances. She approached carefully, with Vexa trailing behind, as if entering uncharted territory together side by side now. The child looked up at Sarah fearfully, eyes wide, but curious beneath furrowed brows, hinting questions she was too young to voice yet understood needed answering through action rather than words alone just then. "Hi there," said Dr. Oyelaran softly, kneeling down so they could meet eye to eye, despite being several inches shorter, standing compared next to Vexa, who towered above her slightly taller form regardless. "My name is Sarah, and I'm here today because we're going to make your arm feel better without hurting." The child stared at the unfamiliar instruments before them, but nodded shakily nonetheless, while grasping tightly onto hand Vexa offered reassuringly behind. "Let's take off these old bandages," suggested Sarah gently, her hands moving deftly, as if she had been trained for this moment all along, even though it was anything new except within context of her years spent practicing human-style care among species with different cultural backgrounds, now finding common ground here finally, after long-held differences. With a swift motion, the old bandages were removed, revealing an arm swollen and bruised from days without proper treatment or pain management. "We're going to use some special medicine that numbs your skin," Sarah explained calmly yet clearly enough for everyone present around her, both human doctor and alien nurse alongside to Vex's patient. "Can I see?" Vexa asked suddenly, peering closer with interest now that first case had begun finally, under supervision of their compromise solution enacted so recently back in Great Hall, where Priestess Irina's words still echoed freshly from memories stored within minds gathered here today to witness start of new era moving forward now towards more compassionate future despite rigid traditions upheld until this very moment. "Of course," replied Sarah warmly, lifting lid off sterile tray holding syringes filled with anesthetic solution before carefully administering small dose into child's arm through thin needle inserted expertly beneath surface layer where pain receptors would be muted temporarily yet effectively, allowing doctors to proceed without causing further distress during process of setting bone properly underneath. The room held its breath as minutes ticked by slowly, anticipation building up along sides and in eyes around, while young patient waited silently, looking unsure still, until finally, after several seconds passing, expression shifted suddenly from fear into confusion instead, when child realized no pain was coming despite injuries sustained earlier today before arrival here, where treatments were now starting afresh based on novel approach being pioneered under Sarah's guidance alongside Vex's support. "Does it hurt?" whispered the small voice, tentatively breaking silence finally, after waiting breathlessly to see outcome. First application of numbing agent administered successfully just moments ago by skilled hands, moving deftly yet purposefully around fragile bones, requiring care now with utmost precision and attention paid toward minimizing discomfort felt during procedure, despite historical norms that would have prohibited such actions until recent changes enacted now under Priestess Irina's guidance. Sarah smiled softly but firmly at young patient standing before them, still clutching hand offered by nurse beside gently in reassuring manner all along through this momentous transition taking place so suddenly yet powerfully here within these walls. "It doesn't hurt," she confirmed carefully, looking into eyes searching for confirmation now of truth they were witnessing together, despite doubts that would linger among many others outside who might not fully comprehend shift happening inside. "Yeah, no pain?" the child repeated, wide-eyed with amazement and relief alike as realization dawned slowly like sunrise breaking through clouds at end long night, finally bringing warmth and light back once more into world darkened by shadows of doubt left behind now, and favor hope moving forward together towards future brighter, even despite challenges ahead still. Sarah shook her head firmly. "Pain is not supposed to be a part of healing," she said gently, while looking around room, seeing faces nodding along beside them, also nurses and doctors alike watching carefully as first steps were taken under new guidelines enacted recently through compromise reached by all parties involved, now bringing change hoped for since long ago despite resistance faced, until finally breaking free today into brighter world ahead where compassion would lead way instead of suffering being seen sacred alone anymore. The child looked up at Sarah with a mix of wonder and gratitude, the first tears welling up in their eyes not from pain but relief. "Thank you," they whispered softly before stepping forward hesitantly to give Sarah an impromptu hug, a brief moment that captured everything about what was happening here today within this new ward, healing through compassion rather than suffering. Sarah returned the embrace with a gentle smile, her heart swelling as she felt Vex's gaze on them both. "You're welcome," she replied softly before pulling back gently to focus again on task ahead together now alongside alien nurse, who would serve crucial role moving forward, ensuring continuity between old ways fading and new methods taking hold that promise future brighter indeed despite long-held traditions enforced, until recently, under strictest interpretations possible. Vexa watched the exchange with tears brimming at corners of eyes, yet also sense overwhelming relief washing over her finally, as realization set in fully about what had been achieved today through their actions, breaking rigid norms upheld for generations, now allowing compassionate care to become part sacred practices moving forward, rather than being shunned outright under false pretenses that pain brought purity instead, when mercy shown, could heal far better indeed. "Thank you, Sarah," Vexa said quietly, as child was led away carefully towards bed, where further treatment would continue under supervision of skilled hands trained now alongside human doctor guiding way despite initial doubts faced along path leading here today. "This changes everything." Sarah shook her head firmly yet kindly in response. "Not just me," she countered gently, while looking into eyes searching for confirmation, still amidst emotions running high all around them, as witness start new era moving forward towards brighter future indeed, where suffering was no longer seen sacred alone anymore, but compassion held equal value alongside divine will recognized now within society at large. Vexa nodded silently, accepting words spoken directly to her from doctor standing beside, who had become ally and fight against rigid norms upheld until recently, under strictest interpretations possible. No transformed into beacon hope leading way towards more compassionate future, where pain could finally be addressed openly instead of ignored outright despite risks involved moving forward now alongside support gathered together here within these walls, and beyond too amongst masses assembled back hall watching closely, events unfolding still despite long-held traditions enforced until today. And so Ward 13 became the cornerstone for change sweeping through hospital ship, as news spread rapidly among staff and patients alike about what was possible when compassion took hold, a quiet revolution sparked by small steps taken here first under supervision of doctor-trained human ways moving forward alongside alien nurse, who had dared break old rules to pave way towards new future brighter indeed despite long-held traditions upheld until recently. The word quickly reached beyond Ward 13, and as days turned into weeks, then months, more wards were transformed. Similarly, Ward 2 became experimental next, following suit soon after, with Ward 10 opening doors openly, now embracing full-range human medical practices alongside traditional TVEX methods blended together seamlessly, where once strict separation existed, sharply dividing both approaches from each other under rigid norms enforced until recently. Priestess Irina's declaration had ripple effects far beyond what anyone could have anticipated back when trial began, questioning established order moving forward instead towards more compassionate path now recognized indeed despite long-held traditions upheld until today. As faith adapted alongside society, suffering was no longer seen as sacred, but rather a burden that needed to be lifted through the power of compassion. One ward became 2, then 10, each opening its doors wider daily, embracing new practices openly now among staff and patients alike, who had once feared consequences, yet now found relief amidst treatments offered freely despite historical norms enforced until recently. The shift was gradual yet unmistakable, signaling a paradigm shift within TVEX society moving forward towards more compassionate understanding, where pain could finally be addressed openly instead of ignored outright. High Nurse Vexa stood at the entrance of Ward 10 as Dr. Sarah Oyelaran entered with another set of medical supplies ready to begin new rounds of treatments under supervision, once again no longer facing doubts or fears held back by rigid norms, but rather embracing future open ahead now towards more compassionate path recognized, indeed despite long-held traditions enforced until recently. "We did it," Vexa said softly without turning away from door leading into ward where patients waited anxiously for relief that had been denied them for so long under previous restrictions. No granted openly here, moving forward with support gathered together strongly behind this new approach pioneered by their alliance, working side by side now towards future brighter, indeed despite challenges faced a long way still. Sarah nodded solemnly in agreement. "We were brave enough to ask," she replied gently, while looking into eyes searching for confirmation that change had come finally, where once it seemed impossible. Yet here they stood witnessing start of brighter world moving forward together towards compassionate healing rather than suffering being seen sacred alone anymore, as faith adapted alongside society recognizing value mercy shown could bring amidst treatment offered freely now despite long-held traditions upheld until today. Transformation continued to spread, each ward becoming a testament to the power of compassion and understanding. The TVEX people were adapting their ancient practices with an open heart, acknowledging that suffering was never sacred but rather something to be alleviated through kindness and empathy. As Sarah turned towards Vexa once more, she felt her hand being squeezed gently in reassurance as they stood together at the threshold of Ward 10. "You changed everything," Vexa said quietly with tears shining brightly against blue-gray skin reflecting light softly around them both. Sarah smiled warmly but shook her head firmly despite emotions running high still surrounding momentous shift happening here within these walls and beyond too amongst masses assembled watching closely, events unfolding daily now towards future brighter, indeed despite long-held traditions enforced until recently. "No, you were brave enough to ask," she corrected gently while looking into eyes searching for confirmation that change had come finally where once it seemed impossible. Yet here they stood witnessing start of compassionate healing moving forward together towards better world ahead indeed. And so Ward 10 was just another milestone in a journey that would continue far beyond its doors, setting an example for the entire TVEX society to follow. The faith and traditions would adapt over time, embracing the newfound understanding that compassion could be as powerful as any divine force, something that Sarah and Vexa had always known deep within their hearts. With these final words, spoken clearly, amidst cheers echoing across vast hall where they stood together symbolically marking turning point towards more compassionate future despite rigid traditions upheld until recently under strictest interpretations possible, the story of Ward 13 came full circle, a testament to bravery, compassion, and hope that even in the darkest times, change is always possible. One ward became 2, then 10. The faith adapted as compassion was recognized alongside divine will, signaling a new era where suffering no longer held its former sanctity, but instead paved way towards brighter future. Indeed, despite challenges faced, a long path leading here today, amidst long-held traditions enforced until recently under strictest interpretations possible. End.